Have you ever felt longing in the place where death usually dwells? I felt it, and it was there amidst the hum of the heart monitors and the smell of alcohol that I realized the body can want to live, even when the soul has already given up. I had been hospitalized for weeks. Time in the hospital doesn't pass. It drags on slowly, as if trying to prove that you no longer have control over anything. The physical pain is exhausting, but what truly kills is the silence. That silence that makes you listen to yourself too much, remember everything you've lost, everything you've stopped feeling. The hallways were cold, the sheets always too clean, and the routine as predictable as the ticking of a clock on the wall. I wasn't expecting anything anymore. No improvements, no visits, no miracles, just another day, another shift, until he walked into the room, the nurse on duty. He wasn't the first doctor to attend to me, but there was something about him that didn't fit in with that environment. The way he held his gloves, the calmness with which he adjusted the IV stand, his firm yet human gaze. While most people looked at me as a patient, he looked at me as if I were still a man. The first thing I felt was shame. Shame for thinking what I thought, for noticing how the morning light outlined his shoulders. But along with the shame came something else, an old, almost forgotten feeling. Desire. It was as if my body, tired, drugged and covered in scars, had remembered, for a brief moment, that it still knew how to react. And it was at that moment that something began to change. He asked few questions. He conveyed more with his eyes than with words. And when he spoke, his voice was firm, yet possessed a gentleness that made time seem less cruel. That first early morning was like a rehearsal for life. While changing the IV drip, he told me that the night shift was the hardest, the one filled with loneliness. He said this, looking at the floor, as if talking about himself. And I understood. Maybe he also carried the same kind of emptiness that I did. In the hospital, loneliness has a sound. It's the sound of the clock marking time that will never return. It's the sound of the curtains swaying in the gentle breeze from the air conditioner. It's the sound of your own breathing trying to prove that you're still here. But that night, for the first time, I didn't hear the silence. I heard the sound of his hands, the sound of his touch, the sound of life slowly returning. I don't know if he realized what was happening. Perhaps yes. Perhaps he felt it when my skin prickled under his touch. Perhaps he noticed my gaze shifting, trying to disguise what my body had already revealed. But he did not back down. On the contrary, he stayed there nearby longer than he needed to. And it was during this extra time that I began to want to live. Not because of the treatment, but because of him. The way she adjusted the sheet, the way she held the syringe, the care that seemed to come from a place that wasn't just professional. He was human. It was intimate. It was dangerous. During the day, the hospital would descend into chaos again, doctors rushing around, anxious families, nurses changing shifts. But at night, the world seemed to stop, and I waited for the night. I waited for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, for his shadow passing through the curtain. I waited, like someone who waits for something they can't ask for, but desires with all their might. He had a different way of treating me. He didn't use words of consolation. He didn't feign pity. He spoke little, but when he did, each word felt like a touch. "You'll get better," he said once, as he helped me sit up in bed. But the tone of voice wasn't that of someone making a medical comment. It was the kind of person who promises something, and I wanted to believe, not out of hope, but because of him. In the following nights, the atmosphere between us began to change. There was nothing explicit, no gesture that could be condemned, no word out of place, but the air between us carried something new, a kind of silent, almost sacred tension. It was as if the entire hospital had vanished, leaving only that small space between my skin and his hands. I wished time would stop right there, and for a few seconds he would stop. The heart rate on the monitor seemed to follow the rhythm of his breathing. I watched his face closely, trying to understand what was behind that calm expression. And the more I looked, the more I saw a man, not a professional, not a nurse, not someone caring for a patient, a man, and perhaps someone who was also trying to heal from something. There was one night when he took longer than usual. The hallway light went out and we were left only with the light from the bedroom, dim, yellowish, almost intimate. He changed the IV drip, straightened the sheet, and asked, in a voice lower than usual, "Are you feeling better today?" I answered yes, but what I wanted to say was something else. I wanted to say that the reason for the improvement wasn't in the treatment, it was right there in front of him. That's when he looked at me. He really looked at me, and I knew it was no longer my imagination. There was something in his eyes that no doctor could explain. Something suggested that, however wrong it might be, we both understood the same thing. At that moment, the entire hospital seemed to disappear. The tubes, the machines, the pain, the fear, it all disappeared. It was just the two of us, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the illness. Life. It wasn't a cure. It was a wish. The kind of desire that isn't confessed, but that the body betrays. He took a step back, as if he had realized he had reached his limit. But it was too late. The line had already been crossed, and we knew that. There was something dangerous in that exchange of glances, something that could destroy us, or save us. From that night on, I couldn't look at him the same way anymore, not even for me, because he not only took care of my body, he awakened what I believed to be dead. And when that happens, when desire invades the place of pain, you understand that what keeps you alive isn't always the medicine. Sometimes it's the right touch at the wrong time. If you've made it this far, it's because some part of this story touched something inside you. Maybe it was loneliness, maybe fear, or maybe that desire that appears when we least expect it, the one the world pretends doesn't exist, but which insists on breathing inside us. So, before we continue, I want to ask you something simple. Comment below what you're feeling right now. Write down what went through your head while listening to each word. I read everything, because each comment is a piece of this conversation that we're building together. And if this kind of story resonates with you, if you believe that love, desire, and regret also deserve to be spoken about without fear, then leave a like now. This helps the video reach more people who need to hear something like this. Take this opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because here each story is a confession, a mirror, and sometimes an open wound that finally finds someone who understands. Now let's continue, because what happened after that night in the hospital is what really changed everything. The following days seemed too long, as if time had suddenly learned to torture. The routine was the same footsteps in the hallway, the same voices, the same smell of medicine, but my body no longer reacted the same way. There was something different in me, a kind of fever that had nothing to do with the illness, but with what I felt when he approached. It was a dangerous mixture of healing and sin, and I no longer knew if I wanted to save myself or surrender. That morning he entered the room with his uniform slightly wrinkled and a tired look, the kind only someone who spends the night awake knows. But there was something more, a discreet, almost imperceptible gleam that betrayed a secret. When our eyes met, he smiled, a short, restrained smile, but enough to take my breath away. The air in the hospital was always heavy, but at that moment it felt different. He approached the bed with his usual calm demeanor, adjusted the IV drip, and checked the notes in the patient's chart. I tried to hide my reaction, but I couldn't help but watch him. Every gesture of his was calculated, precise, yet carried a gentleness that didn't fit the cold atmosphere of a hospital. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, while checking the monitor. "Better than I expected," I replied. And it was true, I wasn't sleeping, I was waiting. I was waiting for the moment he would return, waiting for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the touch of his hand adjusting the sheet. It was as if my body had learned to recognize his shift. And when his shift ended, something in me also went out. Gradually, we began to talk more. He would recount small pieces of his own life, how much he enjoyed the silence of the early morning hours, his fear of administering the wrong medication, the burden of dealing with other people's pain every day. I listened, not as a patient, but as someone who suddenly found himself all too alive. Each of his words was a reminder that, no matter how much his body failed, his heart still beat. One night he was late coming. I watched the wall clock, listening to the ticking of the hands as if waiting for a verdict. When he finally entered, he seemed different. His uniform slightly unbuttoned, his hair disheveled, his gaze more tense. He closed the door slowly, and for a moment, the entire hospital seemed to stop. "I apologize for the delay," he said, lowering his voice. "I had a patient who didn't make it." The silence that followed was dense. I saw the pain in his eyes. It wasn't just professional. It was human. I wanted to reach out, but I hesitated. Then, he did it himself. He touched his fingers to mine for a moment. A simple gesture, but one that made the air between us change temperature. I felt my body react, that kind of reaction that is independent of will, that comes from an ancient, instinctive place. His touch was warm, and the contrast with the cold of the hospital reminded me what it was like to feel again. "Will you get used to it?" I asked, almost in a whisper. "With what?" he replied. "With death." He looked at me for a long moment, as if searching for an answer that didn't exist, and said, "We never get used to it. We only learn to pretend that we do." That phrase stuck with me, because in a way that's what I was doing too. I pretended to be better, pretended to accept what my body could no longer handle, pretended not to notice what was blossoming between us. But the more I pretended, the more the desire grew. That night, his touch lingered longer than necessary. While changing the bandage on my arm, his fingers brushed against my skin. It was a light, technical touch, but imbued with something that technique cannot teach. And when his eyes met mine, I saw he felt it too. The problem is that the hospital doesn't forgive that kind of feeling. Every camera in the hallway, every glance from another professional could be a threat. Desire in there was a crime disguised as instinct. And yet I waited. In the following days, the atmosphere between us changed. He spoke less but looked more. Sometimes he seemed to avoid contact, but his body betrayed him. The way he held the medical record, the way he breathed faster when he approached, the silence between one word and another, everything screamed what his mouth could not say. One early morning I woke up in pain. The monitor alarm beeped, and a few seconds later he appeared. Hurried steps, a serious face, a direct gaze. "Is everything all right?" he asked, and before I could answer he was already examining me, his hands firm and sure. His touch was part of the protocol, I knew that. But the body doesn't understand protocols. It only understands presence. "Everything's all right now," I said, looking at him, and it wasn't a lie. He smiled slightly, the kind of smile that isn't professional but personal. He stood there longer than necessary, watching the monitor without saying anything, until, in a low voice, almost a whisper, he murmured, "I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't stay away." I didn't answer. I just looked at him, because at that moment, any words would have been too little. Silence filled the room. He sat in the chair beside the bed, rested his elbow on his knee, and stared at the floor. His breathing was heavy and mine was uneven. It was then that I realized I wasn't the only one struggling with what I felt. The clock showed almost 3 in the morning when he got up. He took 2 steps to the edge of the bed and said something I'll never forget. "There are patients we treat with medication, and others we try to heal by being close to them." That sentence hit me like an electric shock. I wanted to hold his hand, to tell him I understood, but fear was still stronger. Then he did what I didn't expect. He touched my face, gently, as if asking for permission. I don't know how long we stayed like that, looking at each other, without saying anything. I only know that in that early morning the entire hospital vanished. The machines, the alarms, the pain, everything disappeared. It was just the two of us, the nurse and the man trying to relearn how to live, and perhaps at that moment, we were both being healed. From then on, the night shift ceased to be merely a shift of solitude. It became the moment when desire and fear met, dancing between what was right and what was forbidden. And each time he entered the room, I no longer saw just the nurse. I saw the man who, without realizing, it had given life back to my body and fire to what I believed to be dormant. If you understand what this story is trying to say, write in the comments, "I understand." Because sometimes what heals you isn't the medicine. It's who holds your hand when the whole world tells you to let go. In the following days, I began to realize that the hospital had 2 kinds of silence. The first was the usual one, the heavy silence of the early morning hours, the muffled noise of the machines, the distant sound of footsteps in the corridors. The other was the silence that arose between the two of us, the one that carried everything we couldn't say, everything the world would never understand. It was a silence that burned. Every time he entered the room, the air changed. I felt my body react even before I heard his voice. It was as if my heart learned a new rhythm, a secret beat that only he knew. He would ask me how I was, and I would answer with short phrases, trying to hide what my eyes already screamed. "Better," I would say. But what I wanted to say was something else. I wanted to say that the reason for the improvement was him. One morning, while changing the bandage on my arm, he let out a sigh. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I noticed. I asked if everything was all right. He hesitated, looked at me and said, "It's just tiredness, nothing more." But the way he looked away made me understand that there was something more than just tiredness. Perhaps it was the same weight I felt, the kind that arises when the body wants what reason forbids. Our relationship had become a dangerous game of control. Every touch, every simple gesture carried an invisible tension. The way he adjusted the sheet, the time it took him to let go of my hand after giving me the injection, the quick glance at my reflection in the window, everything seemed charged with intention. And yet, nothing was said. The truth is, desire has a cruel way of manifesting itself. It doesn't need permission. It grows in silence, in the intervals, in the details. And the more we tried to deny it, the more it became part of the routine. At night, I waited for the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. I could recognize them even from a distance. The rhythm, the pause, the discreet dragging of his soles on the waxed floor. It was like a secret code. When he stopped in front of my door, I knew. One night, the tension finally surpassed the limit of what could be disguised. The hospital was silent. Only the dim light from the ward illuminated the corridor. He entered the room quieter than usual. He closed the door slowly, and I felt my whole body react. It wasn't fear. It was something else. "You shouldn't be awake," he said. "Neither do you," I replied. He smiled, a short, almost guilty smile. He approached, checked the IV drip, and then fell silent. The sound of his breathing filled the room. That's when I noticed he was trembling slightly. Not from cold, but from something more serious. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "Yes," he replied, and took a step back. "Something's been wrong since the first time I saw you." His heart raced. He continued, "I try to be professional. I try to keep my distance. But when I come in here, it feels like time changes." I couldn't say anything. I just stared at him. The air between us was heavy, hot, alive. He took another step forward, and I felt the warmth of his skin drawing closer. "I shouldn't be here right now," he said, his voice trembling. "But it is, because I want to be there." Those words hung in the air, pulsing as if they had a life of their own. He stopped beside the bed, and for a moment the world seemed suspended. No sound, no rules, no barriers. Only what existed between the two of us. The touch came slowly. First the fingertips, then the palm of his hand. He touched my arm, and my body reacted before my mind. It was a simple touch, but capable of igniting everything that was dormant. My skin tingled, my heart raced, and the pain that had been with me for weeks, simply vanished. He realized. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Now I am." His gaze was a mixture of tenderness and guilt, as if he were fighting against his own instinct. But the body doesn't lie, and that night, none of us could hide it anymore. Time passed slowly. He stayed there beside me, in silence. Sometimes his touch was firm, like that of a professional. Other times it was light, almost a caress. I knew this couldn't happen, that anyone entering the room would destroy us. But the fear no longer mattered. There was something stronger than fear, the desire to feel alive again. At one point he leaned in. His face was so close to mine that I could smell his skin, the mixture of alcohol and something human, warm, real. "You shouldn't do this," he whispered. "Then don't do it," I said. But he didn't walk away. The distance between us vanished, and in that instant there was no more hospital, pain, illness, or rules. Just two men, trying to heal from the same emptiness. He stepped away first, taking a deep breath. "I need to go," he said. "Go," I replied. But he didn't leave. He stood there, in the doorway, looking at me as if trying to record a memory before it's too late. "You made me break my own promises," he said, "and I don't even know if I want to apologize for that." Then he left, and the sound of the door closing was the cruelest sound I've ever heard. The next morning he didn't come, nor in the afternoon. His shift was changed, and no one explained why. The room seemed bigger, colder, as if the air had become heavy again. The nurses came in, changed the dressings, gave the medicines, but none of them looked at him the way he did. None of them made time stand still. Days turned into weeks, and I started to get better physically. But inside something hurt. His absence was a wound that didn't show up in tests, but bled all the time. One night, I woke up to the sound of rain hitting the window. The clock showed almost 3 in the morning. I don't know why, but I was sure he would come back, and he did. He came in wet, his dark uniform clinging to his body, his gaze firm but tired. "You shouldn't be here," I said. "I know," he replied, "but I needed to see you." The silence that followed said everything that words couldn't. He approached the bed, hesitated for a moment, and placed his hand on my chest. "Your heart is still strong," he said, trying to disguise the trembling in his voice. "You're The one who made him start hitting like that again. He smiled, and his smile was the kind of miracle that medicine can't explain. We stayed like that for a while, him standing, me lying down, both trying to understand what was happening. The sound of the rain outside made time seem slower, almost suspended. "You don't understand," he said. "In here, everything has rules, and the first one is, don't get involved." "But life isn't made of rules," I replied. "It's made of exceptions." He lowered his head, and I saw the conflict in his face. Desire struggling with guilt, the man struggling with the nurse, and for a second, I wanted to free him from it. "I don't want to be your exception," I said. "I want to be the reason you break the rules." He looked up, and at that moment I knew. What was between us wasn't a mistake, it was a confession. If you've made it this far, comment below. I understand. Because sometimes what saves us isn't what the world approves of, it's what the heart insists on calling right, even when everything else says it's wrong. After that early morning, the hospital ceased to be just a place of healing. It became the setting for something I couldn't name, and perhaps didn't even want to. Each corridor seemed to hold a secret. Each gaze seemed to conceal a judgment, but still I couldn't get him out of my head. His touch was still with me, ingrained in my skin, as if it had left a mark that neither time nor medicine could erase. During the day, I tried to act normally, as if everything had gone back to the way it was before. I received visits from the team, answered questions politely, feigned interest in the exams, but as soon as someone mentioned the night shift, my body reacted, betraying the disguise. I knew that at some point it would return, and every second of waiting was a delicious torture, a mixture of fear and desire that reminded me I was still alive. On the third night, the clock was almost midnight when I heard the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. It was impossible to mistake them. The rhythm was the same, calm, steady, like someone carrying secrets in their pocket. When he entered the room, the air seemed to change temperature. He was different. His eyes were darker, his expression tired but determined. He was silent for a few seconds and then said, "I had to switch shifts with a colleague to be able to come. I just wanted to see how you were." "And what do you think?" I asked. He came closer, placed his hand on the sheet and replied, "I think you're better, but you're not cured yet." There was something in that sentence that resonated more deeply than he perhaps intended, because deep down he wasn't talking about the illness. He was talking about what was happening between us. I wanted to respond, but there were no right words. Silence once again took over, and in that silence I understood that what we felt wasn't a momentary mistake. It was a point of no return. He sat in the chair beside the couch bed. The dim light from the lamp cast the shadow of his face on the floor. We spoke little. He told me about his shift, about the weight of dealing with other people's pain every day. "People think you get used to it," he said, staring into space. "But you don't get used to it, you just learn to hide it." I watched his hands, firm, careful, accustomed to the pain of others, and thought about how many lives he had touched, but none like mine, because his touch didn't just heal wounds on the body. He touched what no one else could see. When the clock struck 2 in the morning, he got up. "I need to go," he said, but he stood there without taking the first step. He seemed to be looking for an excuse to stay, and I looked for one to stop him from leaving. "The night is still long," I said. He smiled slightly, a small restrained smile, but full of everything we couldn't say. "It is long," he repeated, "but there are things that need to wait for dawn." Even after he left, the room still felt full of his presence, the smell, the warmth, the echo of his voice. I closed my eyes and realized that desire isn't just physical, it's also memory, and his was already etched within me. The next day, during the dressing change, I noticed that another nurse had taken over the shift. Nobody spoke about him, nobody mentioned anything. That's how the hospital is. What is said in silence fades without warning, but the body remembers, and mine remembered every detail. A week later, I was discharged. I went home with my body healed, but my soul still ailing. The days seemed too long, and the silence of the room was more cruel than that of the hospital. There were no monitors, no smell of alcohol, no footsteps in the hallway, just emptiness. I tried to convince myself that what happened inside had stayed there, but the mind doesn't obey when the heart is still at war. I began to relive each moment, his gaze, the sound of his voice, the brief touch that seemed innocent, but hid a whole universe of desires. I remembered the way he said my name, the calmness he used to hide his nervousness, the pauses between words, pauses that said more than any sentence. Sometimes I found myself wondering if he thought of me too, if, among so many patients, my face still appeared in his memory. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to go back to the hospital. I told myself it was just to say thank you. But deep down, I knew I wanted to see him again. The building seemed the same, cold, silent, lit by lamps that never went out. I passed through the reception area, greeted some familiar faces, and when I reached the hallway of my old room, there he was. The same uniform, the same look. He saw me before I could speak. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a tone that was half reproachful, half worried. "You shouldn't have made me want to come back either." He looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then he sighed and said, "What you're doing isn't fair." "And what is fair?" I asked. "To pretend nothing happened?" He came closer, looked around to make sure we were alone, and whispered, "In here, everything that's true needs to seem like a lie to survive." Those words stuck in my mind, because that was exactly it. Inside, desire had to be disguised as care, love as professionalism, and touch as medical routine. Truth only existed in the space between one glance and another, in the seconds stolen from normality. In the following days, I started going back to the hospital frequently, always with an excuse: exams, consultations, checkups, and he always saw me. The conversations started short, full of tension, but they grew. Sometimes just the quick touch of his hand handing me a piece of paper was enough for me to feel everything again. The body has memory, and desire is the kind of memory that doesn't heal. One afternoon, he called me into an empty room. "I can't go on like this," he said. "Neither do I, but someone will notice. And when they do, I don't mind." He laughed nervously. "You talk as if there are no consequences, and you talk as if it was still possible to go back." For a few seconds, we were silent, the kind of silence that precedes a decision that changes everything. Then he took a step toward me. His face was close enough for me to feel his warm breath mixed with the smell of the hospital, alcohol, soap, and something human. His gaze sought permission, and I gave it without saying a word. The touch was firmer. This time, there was no more hesitation, no fear, only need. The cold wall behind me contrasted with the warmth of his hands. It was intense, quick, silent, and at the same time, it seemed to last an eternity. It wasn't just a meeting of bodies. It was a silent plea for life. When it was all over, he stepped away, breathing heavily. "This can't happen again," he said. "But it will." He stared at me, and in that look I saw everything: the fear, the desire, the regret, and something that resembled love. After he left, I stood there for a while, trying to understand what we had just done. It wasn't guilt I felt, it was something else. Something deeper, more dangerous. The certainty that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something neither of us would know how to control. If you've made it this far, leave a comment below. I understand. Because maybe you too know what it's like to be trapped between what the world allows and what your body begs to feel. Maybe you too have experienced something that shouldn't have happened, but did anyway, and changed everything. After that rainy night, the world seemed to split in two. There was the outside, the hospital, the people, the rules, the shifts, the routines. And there was the inside, what happened between the two of us, what no one could see, what lived in the subtext of our glances and restrained touches. From that moment on, each encounter took on a different weight, as if the air carried a secret that could explode at any instant. In the following days, he tried to keep his distance. He changed shifts, avoided my room, and had other nurses take care of me. But the body doesn't understand what reason tries to impose. And when he finally came back into the room, it was impossible to hide how different we both were. The silence between us screamed, and a simple "good night" was enough to reignite everything we had been trying to bury. He seemed more tense, more withdrawn, with a tired air, like someone carrying too heavy a burden of guilt. "You should hate me," he said without looking at me. "Why?" "Because I made you break something that you may never be able to fix." I was silent for a few seconds. "You didn't break anything," I replied. "You just reminded me that I was still alive." He took a deep breath as if trying to find strength where there is none left. "And living sometimes hurts more than dying." Those words lingered in my mind for hours, maybe days. I didn't know what to do with what we were experiencing. It was love, desire, need all mixed together, and at the same time it was guilt. The guilt of knowing that this couldn't last, that the world wouldn't allow it. But there was something stronger than fear. The memory of his touch, the look that restored my humanity. One early morning I woke to the sound of rain hitting the window. The hospital was in absolute silence, and instinctively I knew he was coming. I can't explain it. It was as if my body sensed his presence. Minutes later the door opened and there he was. Damp hair, open lab coat, an unreadable gaze. "I shouldn't be here," he said, still at the door. "But it is. And that's a problem. So it stays there until it becomes a solution." He smiled slightly, humorlessly, and came closer. The dim light of the lamp reflected in his eyes, and for the first time I realized how wounded I was too. Not by me, but by life. "Do you think I'm brave?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I spend my days tending to broken bodies, but mine, nobody can fix." We remained silent for a few seconds, the kind of silence that tightens the chest and warms the soul at the same time. I reached out and touched his arm. I felt his body tremble, but he didn't pull away. "You take care of everyone," I said. "But who takes care of you?" He chuckled softly, a bitter laugh. "Nobody. Nurses don't have that right. We learn to fix things, not to be fixed." It was there, in that small room, surrounded by medicine and machines, that I understood he wasn't just the man who made me want to live. He was also someone fighting to keep from dying inside. And somehow, we took care of each other, even without being able to admit it. That night, he told me things he had never told anyone. He spoke about his strict father, about the church, about the guilt that had haunted him since adolescence. He spoke of how he learned to hide who he was, how every gesture had to be calculated so as not to arouse suspicion. "Being who I am has always been a mistake," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "and I'm tired of apologizing for it." I listened to him in silence. I wanted to say something, but I realized that nothing could heal such old pain with words. So I just held his hand, and in that touch perhaps he understood that for the first time he wasn't being judged. The hours passed without us noticing. Outside, the sun began to rise, painting the white hospital ceiling orange. He stood up, straightened his lab coat and looked at me with a mixture of tenderness and fear. "If anyone finds out, I know. You don't understand. In here, secrets are expensive. And how much does it cost to live without feeling?" He didn't answer. He simply approached slowly and pressed his lips to my forehead. A simple gesture, but laden with everything that couldn't be said. Then he left, closing the door carefully, like someone sealing a silent pact. Throughout the day, I thought about him, constantly. His touch, his gaze, the fragility hidden behind that white uniform. And I realized that the love between two men, in that context, was more than a feeling. It was an act of resistance, a muffled cry against a world that insists on saying that feeling is wrong. In the following days, our contact became even more discreet. A note folded between the sheets, a quick glance during sunbathing, a "see you later" that sounded like "I'll be waiting for you," and each small gesture was stronger than any word. But the danger was also growing. The hospital is a place where nothing goes unnoticed, and when two people try to hide the impossible, those around them begin to notice what they hadn't seen before. One afternoon, a nurse entered the room and asked, "Did the on-call doctor come by today?" "Yes," I replied, trying to sound natural. "He's been acting strange lately," she said. "He's been distracted and nervous. Even his boss has commented on it." My heart froze. I knew the reason for the distraction, and for the first time I felt real fear, not of being caught, but of him being punished. Later, when he returned, I told him what happened. He turned pale. "They're suspicious. And now? Now I need to protect you." "And who protects you?" He remained silent, his eyes welling with tears. "No one has ever protected me." His words tore me apart inside. I wanted to hug him right there without caring who saw, but he stepped back, looked at me and said, "I need to get away from you for a while." "Don't do that. I have no choice." He left in a hurry without looking back, and for the first time, that room seemed truly empty. The air grew heavy, the silence began to hurt again, and I realized how much the body can ache from longing. The following days were slow, dragging on. I asked about him, and the others would only say, "He's in another department." It felt like an eternity. His absence was physical, like a pain that can't be located, but consumes you. Sometimes I would close my eyes and try to remember his voice, his smell, his touch. That was all I had left. Until one night, almost asleep, I heard a noise at the door. The curtain moved, and for a moment I thought it was a dream. But it was him. He entered slowly, with a tired but determined look. "I told you I would stay away," he whispered, "but I couldn't." His heart raced. He approached the bed, and what happened next wasn't planned. It was inevitable. His touch was no longer that of a nurse. It was that of a man who had finally decided to stop being afraid, and what happened that night was not a sin. It was surrender. It was the reunion of two bodies that only wanted to exist without guilt. When dawn arrived, the room was silent, but something was different. For the first time, there was no guilt in the air, just a strange kind of peace, the peace that comes when you stop fighting against what is. If you've made it this far, leave a comment. I understand, because maybe you, too, have experienced a love that the world wouldn't have the courage to accept, but which, for you, was the only one that truly made you feel alive. That morning, after the night we finally gave ourselves over, felt different. The sun streamed through the hospital window, with a calmness that almost irritated me, as if the world outside had no idea what had happened between those four walls. The sheets still held the warmth of his body, the mingled scent of alcohol and skin, and for a moment I wondered if it had all been a delirium caused by the medication. But it wasn't. I could feel his touch, the weight of each second, the sound of his breath mingling with mine. That memory was real, more real than anything I had experienced in recent years. The nurse didn't return the next day, nor the day after. The shifts changed, and no one could tell me for sure where he was. He must have taken the day off, they said, but I knew. He had disappeared because he needed to get away, because what happened between us didn't fit within the rules of a hospital, nor within the rules of a world that pretends not to see what it doesn't want to accept. And yet, I waited. Every time someone opened the bedroom door, my heart raced. I thought it was him, but it wasn't. And the more time passed, the more I realized the size of the void he had left. My body healed slowly, but his absence was an open wound, one that doesn't heal with medicine. There were nights when I closed my eyes and relived every gesture, every word spoken in silence. It was as if my body insisted on remembering what my mind was trying to forget. Days later, a nurse rushed in and handed me a folded envelope with no return address. She simply said, "They told me to leave this for you." My heart nearly stopped. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, a note written in handwriting I would recognize, even with my eyes closed. I need to step away for a while, not because I want to, but because it's the only way to protect us both. In here everything has a price, and some secrets cost more than I can afford. Take care of yourself, and if you can, forget it, because I won't be able to. I read those lines dozens of times. Each word felt like a blow, and at the same time, a promise, because I won't be able to. That was enough for me to understand that, however much he tried to hide it, the feeling was alive, as much as mine. The following days were a mixture of longing and waiting. Sometimes I thought I heard the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Other times I was sure I could smell the subtle cologne he wore. The body reacts to absence as it reacts to pain. It tries to adapt, but never forgets. His touch still haunted me, in dreams, in memories, in the simple gesture of placing his hand on my chest. It was as if, somehow, he was still watching over me, even from afar. One day, the doctor came with some news. My discharge was near. "You're well enough to continue treatment at home," he said with a technical smile, the kind that doesn't feel anything. And it was at that moment that I realized how much I feared leaving. The hospital, which had once been a prison, now seemed like the only place he could return to. And if I left, what would be left? A healed body and a sick heart. The night before I was discharged, I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, remembering every moment I'd lived there. That's when I heard a low, almost imperceptible sound, the doorknob turning slowly. My heart raced. I knew it was him even before the door opened. He entered silently, his gaze tired but alive. "You're leaving tomorrow," he said, in a tone of voice that mixed sadness and relief. "I know. It's better this way." "For whom?" He didn't answer. He walked to the bed and stood there looking at me. His eyes said everything his mouth couldn't. I wanted to ask where he'd been, why he'd disappeared, but no question would make a difference. What mattered was that he was there, even if it was for the last time. "I shouldn't have come," he murmured. "Then why did you come?" "Because I needed to see you awake, to believe that there's still someone who truly sees me." That sentence struck me. I reached out my hand, and he hesitated for a second before taking it. The touch was brief but intense, laden with everything that had been trapped inside during those days apart. He leaned in slightly, and the scent of his clean lab coat mingled with the perfume of his skin. making me lose track of time. "I'm not a good man," he said almost in a whisper, "but with you I wish I had been." "You were," I replied, "more than you can imagine." He laughed awkwardly, looking away. "I don't know what happens to me when I'm near you. It's like the world disappears, and that scares me. Perhaps because what we feel doesn't need to be explained, but it needs to be hidden. And is this what living is? Silence. A silence that spoke louder than any words." He leaned in and rested his forehead against mine. "If anyone finds out, I'll lose everything. And if nobody knows, you lose yourself." The tears came without warning. He tried to hide them, but I saw them. I saw the man who spent nights saving lives and who was now fighting to save his own. We stayed like that for a few seconds until he slowly walked away without looking back. And when the door closed, I understood that this would be our true goodbye. The next morning, I left. The sun seemed stronger than usual, and the air outside felt strange, almost hostile. The city had its usual rhythm, but inside me everything was different. I walked with the body of a healed man, but with the heart of someone who had left a part of himself behind. Time passed. Months, maybe years. I relearned how to live, or at least I tried. I went back to work, to the routine, to shallow conversations. But every time the smell of hospital alcohol wafted through the air, I felt a knot in my stomach. The body has memory, and mine remembered it. One day I needed to go back to the hospital for a routine checkup. I went in trying to pretend I was just another patient, but every step down the corridors was like reliving everything. The walls, the sound of the monitors, the smell of disinfectant. Everything brought back what I had tried to erase. When I got to the reception desk, a new nurse attended to me. I asked, without thinking, "Does he still work here?" She looked confused. "Who?" "A nurse. Tall, dark hair, calm. Gaze. Ah, yes. He requested a transfer a while ago. He's in another hospital now." I left there unsure if it relieved me or hurt me even more. The truth is, I didn't want answers. I just wanted to believe he was okay, even if he was far away. And deep down, I knew that you never really say goodbye to someone who awakens what was dead. Sometimes at night, I still dream about him. In the dream, I'm lying in the same room, and he comes in, just like before, with that look that used to disarm me. He comes closer, touches my hand and says, "This isn't a treatment, it's a secret." And I wake up with my heart racing, my body reacting like that first time. And I realize that no matter how much time passes, some wounds aren't meant to heal. They're meant to remind us that we're still capable of feeling. If you've made it this far, just leave a one-sentence comment. Some touches are never forgotten, because perhaps you too have experienced something that time couldn't erase. Something that wasn't a cure, but made you want to live again. Time is a cruel doctor. It heals on the outside but leaves invisible wounds on the inside like scars that the soul learns to hide. After that frustrating reunion, I went home trying to convince myself that everything I experienced with him was in the past. But the past is stubborn. It always finds a way to return. Sometimes it comes in dreams, sometimes in memories, sometimes in the body, which reacts without permission, as if it had a will of its own. And with me it was like that. My body remembered his touch, his gaze, his silence. It was as if each heartbeat repeated his name. The months went by, and routine swallowed me up again. Work, obligations, long and lonely nights. But even with all that, something was different. I was no longer the same man who entered that hospital. I had learned that desire is not a sin. It's proof that the heart is still alive. And however much I tried to deny it, he was the one who taught me that. The nurse on duty, the one who transformed fear into desire and pain into memory. Some days were bearable, others seemed endless. I found myself wondering where he was, if he had forgotten me, if he continued caring for other bodies with the same care he had for mine. And sometimes I wondered if he thought of me too, if his body still reacted to the memory of what we lived through. The love between two men, when it is true, carries a weight that few can bear, not because it is wrong, but because the world insists on calling wrong what is merely human. One night, after months without news, I went for a walk. The cold wind hit my face, and I remembered his touch, that firm yet tender touch that seemed capable of awakening even what was already dead within me. I went into a small bar, one of those that seem forgotten by time, just to escape the silence of home for a while. I ordered a drink, any drink, and stood there, watching the faces go by. That's when I saw him. He was there, sitting in a corner alone with his usual calm posture, but with a different look, a tired look, as if carrying the weight of having felt too much. For a second I thought it was an illusion, but it wasn't. He saw me too. Our eyes met and time stopped. There was no more noise, no more people, just the two of us, as if the world had decided to give us back that moment that fate had stolen. I stood up slowly, afraid that any sudden movement would make everything disappear. I walked towards him, and each step seemed like an eternity. When I stood before him, words vanished. I could only say, "So this is where you were hiding." He smiled, but the smile held sadness. I wasn't hiding, just trying to move on. We sat down. The silence between us was dense, but not uncomfortable. It was a silence full of memories, of everything that hadn't been said. "I thought I'd never see you again," I said. He looked at me, serious, and replied, "I thought so too. But I guess certain things don't end just because we try." We talked for hours, about life, about work, about what came after that. He told me he had moved to another city, but had recently returned to take care of his sick mother. And as he spoke, I realized how much time had transformed him. He was more mature, more serene, but his gaze remained the same, that gaze that used to disarm me. "I still remember the hospital," he confessed, his voice low, "every word, every night. And I still wonder to this day if I did the right thing in leaving." "He did what he needed to do to survive," I replied, but he shook his head. "Surviving isn't the same as living." That phrase kept hammering in my mind, and it was there, in that silent bar, that I realized there was still something between us, something that time couldn't erase. He lightly touched my arm, and that touch was enough to reignite everything. My body reacted as if it had never forgotten. The same shiver, the same heat, the same suppressed desire. "Do you still feel it?" he asked. "More than I should," I replied. "So why are we pretending we're not?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to run away, like before. Another part wanted to stay there forever. He came closer, his eyes fixed on mine, and the air seemed to thin. "I spent years taking care of bodies that wanted to live," he said, "but the only one I really wanted to touch was yours." The world vanished. Everything I remembered came rushing back. The smell of alcohol, the cold of the hospital, his breath on my neck. And there in that bar, I felt the same thing I felt that first night. That desire is the most sincere way of saying, "I'm still here." But there was something different this time. It wasn't the same forbidden impulse anymore. It was maturity. It was pain and courage mixed together. I looked at him and saw a man who also carried invisible scars, not only from what we lived through, but from what we were never able to live through. We stood there in silence until he said, "I don't want to hide what I feel anymore. Life is too short to keep apologizing for what makes us human." I wanted to believe, but fear still lingered within me. What if the world doesn't understand? Then the problem lies with the world. It was the simplest and most beautiful answer he could have given. When we left the bar, the air on the street felt different. There was something liberating about simply walking beside him without having to pretend. And it was in that instant that I understood what he meant when he said he took care of me. He didn't just take care of my physical wounds, he took care of my soul. He taught me that living isn't about protecting yourself from what's dangerous, but about allowing yourself to feel what's real. And reality is always dangerous. That night didn't end like the first. There was no rush, no guilt, no prohibitions. There was a calm silence, the kind that only exists between two people who have lost each other and found each other again. He looked at me, and without saying anything, I knew that what we had experienced before hadn't been a mistake. It had been the beginning of something that wasn't over yet. As we walked, the wind whipped against our faces, and I realized that time, despite being cruel, is also generous. It gives us a second chance to feel, and perhaps that's what we were doing there, feeling again, without apologizing. If you've made it this far, I'd like you to comment with one sentence. Time does not erase what is true. Write this down here, because sometimes we need to remember that what is real survives fear, rules, and even time. After that night, something in me changed definitively. It wasn't just about him anymore, or about desire, or about the reunion. It was about everything I had tried to erase and that suddenly returned with force, as if no time had passed. Walking beside him was like reopening a wound that, instead of hurting, allowed me to breathe. His touch was still alive in me, but now it had a different weight, the weight of history, of distance, and of the courage that only those who have lost everything can possess. In the days that followed, I tried to follow my routine. Wake up, work, sleep. But something inside me pulsed differently. My body seemed more alert, more alive, as if waiting for something I couldn't name. I spent my days thinking about him, and my nights remembering everything we didn't say. It's curious how silence can be stronger than any word. His voice echoed in my head like a confession that hadn't yet ended. We met a few more times, never planned, always by chance, or perhaps it was fate playing with us once again. There was a strange naturalness to these encounters, as if the universe had decided to put us on each other's path until the story made sense. In each conversation, I felt we were rebuilding something not from scratch, but from the rubble of everything that fear had destroyed. One afternoon, he invited me for coffee. The place was simple, smelling of fresh bread and with distant laughter. We sat at a table in the back, away from prying eyes. "I've thought a lot about us," he said, stirring his coffee without looking at me, "and about what I ran away from." "You didn't run away," I replied. "You just did what you needed to do to survive." He laughed, but it was a sad laugh. Survival is what we do when we have no choice. But I always had one, and I chose fear. We remained silent. The words weighed heavily. He looked at me. Then, and for a moment, I saw the same look from those early mornings in the hospital, the same look that made time stand still. "You know what I realized?" he said. "I've taken care of so many people, but only with you did I learn what it means to truly want to heal. Because when we love, the pain of another becomes our own." Those words disarmed me. I wanted to say that I understood him, that I felt the same, but the words wouldn't come out. The love between two older men has a raw truth. It's made of silences, of restrained gestures, of fear disguised as prudence. It's not about promises. It's about presence, about being there, even when the world doesn't understand. He continued, "I don't want us to live hiding what we feel. I know time has passed, that maybe life has taken us to different places, but what I felt with you hasn't happened before, and I doubt it will happen again." His honesty hit me like a punch. I spent years trying to forget, and he, years trying to accept. And now there, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, I understood that love doesn't have an expiration date. It just changes form. We left there and walked together to the parking lot. The city seemed slower, the air lighter. "Will you let me take care of you again?" he asked, and I laughed, unable to hide my emotion. "You never stopped taking care of me." In the following days, he began to appear more often. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes he just stayed silent with me. He didn't need much. His presence was enough to make the world seem bearable. His touch was different. It wasn't the clinical touch of a nurse, but the touch of someone who knows the body and soul of the person he touches. A touch that says, "I know where it hurts." One night, he arrived late. I was sitting on the porch, and he approached silently. "Are you still in pain?" he asked. "It depends on which one." He smiled, that gentle smile I never quite managed to decipher. "From the soul, because that's the one that takes the longest to heal." "Sometimes," I replied, "but when you're here it hurts less." What happened next was simple but intense. He held my hand, unhurriedly, without guilt, and stood there, looking at me. Time stopped again, and I understood that life had given me a second chance, even if silently. He leaned in, rested his forehead against mine, and said something I will never forget. "I don't want to be your medicine. I want to be the reason you don't need them anymore." It was at that moment that I realized that mature love isn't made of exaggerated promises. It's made of small gestures that say everything. The way he adjusted the blanket on my shoulders, the care with which he observed me, the patience in the silences, everything about him was healing. Over time, I stopped feeling like a patient. I became a man again. I felt my body pulsate again, not from pain, but from desire. And this time, desire didn't frighten me. It came accompanied by peace, by a tenderness I no longer knew existed. Sometimes when he touched me, I would close my eyes just to feel the moment, the warmth of his hands, the scent of his skin, the soft sound of his breathing. It was as if each touch said, "You survived. Now you can live." But life, as always, exacts its price, and our love, however real it was, still lived under the threat of being judged. There were days when the fear returned, not of what I felt, but of what the world would do if it knew. He noticed, and without saying anything, he would just look at me, and that look was enough to calm me. "We don't need the world to understand," he would say, "just that it doesn't stop us." I began to understand that love between two mature men is an act of resistance, resisting time, prejudice, old guilts, the versions of ourselves that the world has tried to impose. It's a love that doesn't shout, but also doesn't remain silent. It's the kind of love that heals more than the body. It heals fear. One afternoon, he took me to the same park where I used to walk before I got sick. The sun was low, its golden light filtering through the trees. We sat on a bench, watching people go by. He looked at me and said, "You know what I admire most about you? Even when you gave up on life, you still hoped for something, and that something was love." At that moment, I realized he was right. Love is what remains when everything else has fallen apart. It's what keeps the heart beating, even if slowly. And I felt that what we had, however improbable it seemed, was real, and that was enough. If you've made it this far, I'd like you to comment with one sentence. Love still exists, even when the world doubts. Write this down here so I know you understood what this story is trying to say. Because in the end, what we need most is to remember that love, even forbidden, improbable, silent love, is still what makes us want to live again. Life with him was transforming into something I never thought I'd experience again. It was as if, after so many years trying to survive, I was finally learning to truly exist. The hospital was behind me, but sometimes I'd still wake up in the middle of the night to that same distant sound of the machines, the same smell of alcohol, as if the past were always lurking. But now the sound of my heart was the sound that mattered most to me, because it beat strong, rhythmic, full of life, and the reason for that was sleeping beside me. With him, time took on a different rhythm. The mornings were slower. The coffees tasted like conversation, and the silence, which had once tormented me, became the safest place in the world. He was still the same nurse with firm gestures and a calm gaze. But with me, he let slip another version of himself, that of a man who had also been afraid, who had also needed to hide, and who now, little by little, was allowing himself to feel without apologizing. There were days when the fear returned, of course. Love between two older men still bears the marks of a time when it was forbidden even to think about it. Sometimes, a sideways glance on the street, a veiled comment was enough, and the world seemed too small to contain what we felt. But he always said, "Let them talk. We just need to keep existing." And that simple phrase became a shield, because that's what it was. For us to love was to exist despite the world. He taught me the value of gestures, the way he adjusted the pillow, the way he rested his hand on the back of my neck while I spoke, the way he looked at me before saying anything. It wasn't about words, it was about presence. And after so long being cared for only by doctors, medicine, and routines, I understood that what I was missing was this: someone who cared for me out of desire, not obligation. One day we went back to the hospital together. I needed a routine checkup, and he insisted on going with me. Walking through those corridors beside him was like revisiting a ghost. The white walls, the smells, the sounds, everything reminded me of the first time I saw him, and how that cold, impersonal place became the setting where I began to be reborn. The nurses still recognized him, the patients greeted him, and I watched from a distance, proud. He had no idea how important he was. While we waited for the test results, he looked at me and said, "You know, every time I come back here, I remember the night it all began. Back then, I thought I was helping you survive. Today I understand that it was you who healed me." Those words pierced me like a scalpel, cutting silently without pain but with precision. Because he was right. The truth is, we healed together. Me from the physical illness, him from the illness of fear. On the way home, he turned on the radio. An old song was playing, one of those that seemed written for someone who loved in secret. He placed his hand on mine and left it there. He didn't say anything, and he didn't need to. The music said it all. "I know we don't have the right to start over," I whispered, almost as if confessing. He replied, "We don't need rights, we need courage." That phrase stuck with me. Courage. It was what we always lacked, and now it was what kept us alive. Loving a man after everything, after so much time, wasn't a choice, it was an act of resistance. Society expected us to grow old with shame, with silence, with regret, but we chose to grow old with truth. The following weeks were a reunion with what I believed I had lost. We went back to walking in the park like we did before the illness. Sometimes he would wait for me at the gate with that gentle smile, and I would feel my heart race as if I were 20 years old again. His touch was different. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't afraid, just a silent desire to stay. At night we would lie in silence, the sound of our breathing mingling, and I thought that this was how love should be, calm, firm, and without hiding. But the world, even when you try to ignore it, always finds a way to test what is real. One day a neighbor commented, "Is that young man who lives with you your son?" I could have lied, but I couldn't. I looked at her and said, "No, he's the one who taught me how to live." She was silent for a few seconds, and then just nodded. And for the first time I didn't feel ashamed, I felt proud. Proud to have lived what I lived, to have loved what the world said was wrong, and to be there, whole, proving that love doesn't need permission to exist. Later I told him what happened. He looked at me seriously and asked, "And how did you feel?" "Freedom," I replied. He smiled. "Then it was worth it." That night was different. There was no fear, no hesitation. His touch was firmer, more genuine. It was no longer the touch of a nurse, nor of someone trying to heal another. It was the touch of a man who loved. And I let my body say everything my mouth never dared to say. My skin recognized the path. The warmth returned. Desire mingled with tenderness. And in that instant, I understood that love doesn't die. It just waits for the right moment to be reborn. Then, lying side by side, he ran his hand over my chest and said, "Do you know what I like most about you, Than? The way you still believe you can start over." And I laughed, because he didn't know. He was the reason I still believed. Dawn crept slowly through the window, and for a moment I wished time would stop there. He slept beside me, his breathing light, peace etched on his face. I looked at him and thought of everything we had faced to get to this point. The fear, the guilt, the silence, the judgment, all of that seemed insignificant compared to what we felt now. The world outside was still the same, intolerant, full of pointing fingers and mouths ready to judge. But inside that room, inside that story, there was a piece of truth that no one could steal, and that truth was simple. Two men who met on the edge between life and death, and who chose to live. If you've made it this far, it's because this story resonated with some part of you. Perhaps the part that still believes love can happen at any stage of life, or the part that knows how difficult it is to feel what the world insists on denying. So I want to ask you something simple. Subscribe to the channel now, because here we continue talking about these truths that nobody dares to tell. Leave a like so I know you stayed until the end. It really helps to bring these stories to more people who need to hear something like this. And leave a comment below with a sentence for me. I believe in the courage to feel. I want to see who really stayed with me until the very last second. And before you leave, take a look at the next video that's appearing on the screen. I'm sure that if this story touched you, the next one will leave you speechless. See you there.